I'll just start by just giving you a sense of my background. I started out as a paper conservator working at the British Museum, and I now run two conservation programs here. One is about conservation of fine art, and the other is about preventive conservation, so caring for collections, managing the environment, and as a result of that I also manage Gallery North. So I provide guidance on display, storage and transit. It was interesting listening to the earlier presentations, and this really this great link with the history of artists, materials and techniques. You know, hearing about what Cennini had written about pigments all those centuries ago, because that's really what my work is all about. It's about understanding the materials that artists have used, their techniques, how those materials deteriorate, or as I've now learned to say, change, because sometimes change is in contemporary terms considered to be something desirable, as opposed to with traditional works of art where it's not always considered to be acceptable at all. So I need to understand what the materials are made from, how they deteriorate and how we can stabilise them. And Cennini was also very familiar with the change in materials. He observed how lead white would darken, and so they were, from that moment on, they were always looking for another white, a better white, a white which was better when mixed as a watercolour as opposed to in an oil medium. And since then, work of conservators has not just involved cleaning and repairing materials and works of art, but also analysing and researching them. So we now know that lead white was basic lead carbonate, and it was very sensitive to sulphur in the atmosphere, and that's what caused it to darken. Just like silver tarnishes, it's a kind of a similar thing, and you get lead sulphide being created. And we have ways of turning that back to a white, not to the original white, but to something called lead sulphate. So the other thing I picked up on, which I thought was very interesting, was this sense of place. And you sometimes find with pigments that the name will tell you, Frankfurt black, for instance, Indian yellow, you already know kind of where it's come from. And I also think that in my work there is this tremendous interest in the huge range of materials that artists have derived pigments from. Think back to the wonderful lapis lazuli, which came from the mountains of Afghanistan. Tremendous journey in those days, and then had to be ground down to a particular particle size. Overgrind it, you lost the colour completely. If you don't grind it enough, you don't get the full value. And this was a pigment which was more valuable than gold, a bit like Tyrian purple, which came from seashells found in the Mediterranean, and made this priceless colour, which by legislation only the very most noble aristocrats were allowed to wear. So, to go on to my talk today, I've tried to join in with this theme of black and brown, and my presentation is called Black to Brown. And I'm going to be concentrating on the inks that have been used by artists over the ages. So just first of all, just talk about the importance of understanding ink, why you need to know what it can bring to you. And then I'm just going to touch on a range of historic black and brown inks. And then I'm going to focus on this one ink called Ironwood ink, just a little bit of its history, how it's been used, who it's been used by, and then, for me as a conservator, the all-important degradation process and the change that takes place. And then I'm going to finish by looking at the aesthetic impact of colour change. So, the reason why I think it's important to understand the inks that you're looking at and selecting from is that it can provide, for me as a conservator, or maybe you as an artist, guidance on the care that you're going to provide. Certain materials need to have a certain environment in terms of temperature and humidity. It provides guidance on conservation. Some materials, if you wash them, they'll be solubilized. Others, if you have too high a light level, they'll lose their colour or change their colour completely. It can also, if you're looking at historic works, it can give you an indication of the date of the artwork, or if you know what the material is, it can give you an indication of the ink. And it can also provide an indication of the original intention of the artist if you know whether it's changed or not. And by understanding all of that, it gives you control over the long-term appearance of your own work. So these are just a few of the materials that have been used to make inks. There's carbon, which we've been looking at here, then the iron and the galls, something called bister, and then sepia. And I've got some samples I'll get out later on if you have time. Now, carbon's been used for a very long time in China through to Europe. It comes from a variety of sources, as we've heard, lamp black, ivory black, all of which indicate where it's derived from. In inks, these particles are generally suspended in water to make it ink, with sometimes the addition of animal glue or a gum. The selection will often be determined by the particle size. Depends if you're wanting a pigment, you perhaps go for a larger particle size, but generally speaking, with the inks, we want it as fine as possible so that you can use it with a pen. In terms of its sort of behaviour, carbon can smudge quite easily. It's been used since medieval times to write on parchment and vellum. Because of the smooth surface of parchment and vellum, it's quite easily detached. And I'll come back to that in a little while, because one of the problems with it was if you had a legal document and the ink could be abraded, then it had certain security issues associated with it. The good thing in terms of its conservation is it's very inert, it's very stable, doesn't get affected by light or generally any atmospheric conditions, and it's not solubilized in water. And this is one of the forms you can get it in, a Chinese ink stick, simply used by grinding it with water in a little vessel like this, will be used with a brush or with a pen. And then we go, it's an example that you've seen already of ivory black. It's one of the sources that we've already talked about. The great thing about it is the black doesn't change. This is a 15th century drawing, and it's as black as the day it was first created. And so if that's what you want, then you need to understand which of the materials is going to suit your purpose. Sepia, I mean, this is just fantastic. It's derived from the ink sac of the cuttlefish. And you can see actually quite easily how that was developed. You know, somebody would be cooking pasta nera or whatever it was. Oh yeah, I think you actually did this with your students. There was some confusion over which was for the pasta and which was for the ink. But you can see how some of these sources have been identified. Some of them are, and I think probably iron gall ink is one of them, is slightly strange. Used since the 19th century, so you know if you've got a brown ink that it's not going to be sepia if you know it's earlier than the 19th century. There's only very few places in Italy that used it prior to that. It's organic, again the distinction between organic and inorganic. The organic materials are all these natural things like plants from plant sources, and they are very sensitive to high light levels and can fade. It's drawn, because it's very liquid as a dye, it's drawn into the surface of absorbent materials such as paper, so it doesn't have this problem of being abraded like the carbon, but it can be partially solubilized in water. Here's our cuttlefish, and that's the ink sac. You get them in dry form. This is what you were so excited about to get from Winsor & Newton. It is exciting when you see these materials. You'd be glad to know that you can actually just buy it in powder form from a company like Parchment, so you don't have to make the odyssey. And this is what a drawing would look like in sepia, and you can see that it's got a much stronger brown tonality than the carbon ink. And then we move on to bister. This is made from wood which has been burnt. It's been used since about the 16th century. The source of the wood will impact on the colour that you get. So the chestnut gets a rich golden brown. The birch creates a more yellowish brown. Again, it's organic, so it has all these sensitivities to the environment that I've already mentioned. And you can sometimes find that there's kind of like oily tar-like residues in the ink. And that is also available from a company like Kramer, and it creates this more golden colour. This is a Tiepolo, and I've got a similar drawing by Tiepolo in the iron walling, so we'll be able to compare and contrast the differences. Now we go into the iron walling. This has been used since about the 12th century. It was deliberately created to get away from this problem that they had with the carbon ink being abraded from smooth surfaces like parchment and vellum. It is not only drawn into the surface of the sport, but it actually bites its way in, and I use that term rather loosely because it's a corrosion, it's a degradation of the surface, which as a result makes it a much more permanent material for a while, and I'll be showing you the for a while bit in a moment. Because it contains iron, iron degrades organic materials, and when it's created it already has a low pH, and that actually drops over time and creates a range of changes in the ink. This is an example of iron gall ink on parchment, and you can actually see, I hope, in some of these areas, there are holes in the surface right through the parchment. That's because of this corrosive effect of the ink. So permanent up to a point of completely disappearing. This is what the iron gall ink is made of. The gall nuts, which you've seen, they come from a lot of different sources. And then the ferrous sulfate, that's the iron part. And then it's mixed with usually water and some sort of gum. But there are a lot of very old recipes. I brought a couple of books here where you can have a look. Some people use wine, some people use beer. In Armenia, in the 10th century, they had a very good understanding of this ink, and they had quite elaborate recipes, including scented oils and materials which were introduced to retard this degradation. They would use the rind of pomegranate as an antioxidant. And these are the famous galls. These are Aleppo galls. These were considered to be the very best because they have a very high content of tannin. Now, the reason that these are created, you perhaps are wondering where they do come from. If not, I'm going to tell you anyway. These are they growing in the oak trees. And they're created because a wasp lays its egg in these little branches. And as the egg, because it's kind of a source of irritation, it develops this defense against this creature which is growing in it. And these round things, these galls, are developed. And then eventually they hatch out, they make little holes, and they, having grown to the appropriate size, they burrow their way out, and these are they, much bigger than they actually are. These are the other two ingredients, the ferrous sulfate and the gum arabic, and they're all mixed together, ground together in a mortar of some sort. And you'll be pleased to know that in the absence of all of those things, you can actually go and buy the iron gall ink from a number of suppliers. This is actually somebody who lives in Yorkshire, and he's a calligrapher, and I'll be showing you just an example of his work in a moment. So this is another Tiepolo. So this is in a different ink, and I'll be comparing them more closely in a moment. But you can see that this is a richer brown. It's not the golden brown of the earlier work, and it's got a much broader range of tone, a lot of much darker areas in parts of it. So here we have the earlier one. You see much more golden, the Bista ink, and that's again just going back to the sepia one. So why is this important? Well, it's important because it's been used, this ink has been used by artists from Guercino to Rembrandt, Claude Lorraine, writers such as Ibsen, and virtually the whole of the history of the world at one time was written in this ink. So the archives of a very broad period of history is written in it, and the fact that it degrades the support it's on is a cause of great concern, and as a result quite a number of us have been researching it why it degrades, how it degrades, and how to stabilise it. And we have had a series of conferences, and one of the outputs from that was this publication on iron ink. Some of it highly technical and chemical, but some of it more about the materials and the artists who used it. So the changes. Over time, it changes, resulting in the degradation of the support material. We saw that example. Changes in the colour of the ink, and inscriptions can become visible on the verso. And this can all help with your identification of the ink, because it's the only brown ink that does that. And of course, areas of loss. So the degradation, as it oxidizes, it becomes more acidic. And this acidity causes the support material to degrade. And this starts with just a slight blurring around the edges of the lines, and then gradually the inscription becomes visible on the other side, the underside of the support, and eventually you can get areas that are lost. And there's this schematic sort of trail of destruction that takes place from this is a cross-section of the ink on top of the paper, and then how gradually the process takes place to the point where you get serious loss of material at the bottom. And you can see here, this is the slight blurring that I'm talking about, that you can see when you look at the front of it. And that's a hand in the top there. I just mentioned that because I'll show you the other side now. And this is the hand here, and then that mark. You see it's gone all the way through the paper. The prognosis for this drawing is that eventually there will be areas of loss unless some form of stabilisation is carried out. And this is a clear example of the type of loss you can get. And you can see why people call it corrosion, because it does actually look almost charred. And a very serious example, this is a Guercino in the Royal Collection. And you can see that, especially where there's been lots of cross-hatching, there are these large areas of the image which are missing. And it's important to note that the colour of this ink, and I'll be touching on that in a moment, is particularly dark purple-ish black ink that he used. So the changes in the colour, when it's first created, it is in fact black. All of these drawings were black. And it's only as it oxidizes that it changes to brown. And the shade of brown will range from this dark purpley browns that you get with the Guercinos to a more light golden brown. And that's determined not by the age, but by the components, the constituent ingredients, and their relative proportions. So we know that those Guercinos are particularly acidic. And the reason that there's this range in the type of ink is because everyone made their own. There was no standard recipe. Everybody had a variation and often kept it very secret. We do know from the research that's been carried out that the darker inks are higher in tannins and have a lower pH, and as a result, they tend to degrade the support more rapidly. And this is the calligrapher that was called Brian Walker. He actually makes his own inks, which he sells, and this is a fair